Imagine a company so powerful it could declare war on entire nations, mint its own currency, and execute foreign leaders, all while being publicly traded on a stock exchange. Between 1602 and 1799, the Dutch East India Company generated profits equivalent to $7.9 trillion in today's money. Not just revenues, actual profits. This single corporation controlled territory larger than Europe, commanded military forces bigger than most national armies, and wielded diplomatic power that made kings negotiate as equals rather than rulers. But here's what nobody tells you about the VOC. They weren't just traders who happened to get political power. They were the world's first multinational corporation designed from day one to use systematic violence, economic warfare, and technological superiority to build a corporate empire spanning 3 continents. The numbers are absolutely staggering. The VOC operated 4,185 ships over its 200-year existence, more vessels than the Spanish, Portuguese, and English fleets combined. They employed 2.5 million people across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Their private armies conquered the Spice Islands, controlled the Cape of Good Hope, and established trading posts from Japan to Persia. Most importantly, they pioneered business practices that every modern corporation still uses today. Limited liability that protected investors from corporate crimes. Shareholder capitalism that prioritized profits over human welfare. Vertical integration that controlled every stage of production and distribution. Market manipulation that created artificial scarcity to maximize prices. The Dutch didn't just participate in the spice trade, they weaponized it. When local rulers refused to grant exclusive trading rights, VOC armies invaded their territories. When competing European merchants appeared in Asian markets, VOC fleets sank their ships. When Asian producers tried to sell directly to consumers, VOC officials executed them for violating corporate monopoly agreements. Their shareholders celebrated these policies as brilliant business strategy. VOC stock generated average annual returns of 18% for nearly 2 centuries, performance that would make modern hedge fund managers weep with envy. Dividend payments to Dutch investors exceeded the entire government budgets of most European nations. Yet this corporate success was built on systematic exploitation that killed millions of people, destroyed entire civilizations, and established precedents for corporate behavior that continue to shape global capitalism today. The VOC created something unprecedented in human history. A profit-driven organization with sovereign power to wage war, impose taxes, and govern populations across multiple continents. They proved that private corporations could achieve imperial control more efficiently than traditional governments, if they were willing to use unlimited violence in pursuit of unlimited profits. This is the story of how 7 Dutch merchants created the template for modern corporate power. This is the story of the world's first global empire built not by kings or generals, but by shareholders and accountants who discovered that systematic brutality could generate extraordinary returns on investment. This is the story of the VOC, the company that taught the world how to turn human suffering into shareholder profits. The Dutch East India Company began with a simple observation: whoever controlled the spice trade controlled the global economy. But unlike other European powers that sent expeditions hoping for quick profits, the Dutch created something revolutionary, a permanent corporate institution designed to achieve total monopoly control over Asian commerce through systematic military and economic warfare. Picture Amsterdam in 1595. The city hummed with maritime activity as Dutch merchants counted profits from their latest Indonesian expeditions. A single voyage to the Spice Islands could generate 400% returns on investment. Nutmeg purchased for 3 Dutch guilders in the Banda Islands sold for 300 guilders in European markets. Black pepper, cinnamon, and cloves commanded similar profit margins, but these extraordinary profits created an unexpected problem: too much competition among Dutch merchants themselves. Multiple Dutch companies were simultaneously sending expeditions to Asia, driving up local purchase prices while flooding European markets with spices. Local Indonesian rulers played Dutch competitors against each other, demanding higher prices and better terms for access to spice-producing territories. Even worse, Portuguese and English merchants were expanding their Asian operations, threatening Dutch commercial advantages. Johan van Oldenbarneveld, serving as Chief Minister of Holland Province, understood that chaotic competition was destroying Dutch commercial opportunities. His analysis, presented to the States General in 1600, identified the fundamental problem. Individual Dutch merchants lack sufficient capital to maintain permanent Asian establishments, adequate military protection, or coordinated commercial policies. We are allowing foreign competitors to exploit our organizational weaknesses despite our superior maritime capabilities. The solution was unprecedented in economic history. Merge competing Dutch companies into a single corporate entity with sufficient capital, military power, and political authority to achieve permanent control over Asian spice production and distribution. The company charter, granted March 20, 1602, created something that had never existed before: a private corporation with sovereign governmental powers. The VOC could establish colonies, maintain armies and navies, wage wars, negotiate treaties, mint currency, and impose taxes. No European government had ever granted such extensive powers to a private business organization. More importantly, the charter established the company as a joint stock corporation, where ownership was divided among shareholders who could buy and sell their stakes without affecting company operations. This meant the VOC could accumulate capital from hundreds of investors while maintaining unified management and strategic planning. The initial capitalization totaled 6.4 million guilders, roughly 100 million in modern currency. This was more capital than most European governments controlled, more than any previous trading expedition had attempted to raise, and more than the Portuguese and English East India companies would accumulate for decades. But capital alone wouldn't ensure success against established Portuguese and English competitors who already controlled key Asian ports and maintained relationships with local rulers. The VOC needed systematic advantages that would allow them to outcompete existing European merchants while preventing new competitors from challenging Dutch control. The strategic plan was brilliantly ruthless. Rather than accepting existing patterns of Asian trade, where European merchants purchased spices from local producers who sold to multiple buyers, the VOC would establish exclusive control over spice production itself. They would negotiate treaties that granted monopoly rights to purchase entire harvests. They would build fortifications that prevented competing merchants from accessing spice-producing areas. Most importantly, they would use military force to eliminate any opposition to Dutch commercial monopoly. Peter Botha, appointed as the first Governor-General, received explicit instructions that revealed the company's true intentions. You will establish permanent Dutch control over spice production in the Indonesian archipelago through whatever means prove necessary. Competing European merchants will be excluded from Dutch-controlled territories. Local rulers who cooperate will receive protection and financial benefits. Local rulers who resist will face military consequences until cooperation is achieved. What the directors called whatever means prove necessary included systematic violence that previous European trading expeditions had avoided. The VOC would burn competing merchants' facilities, execute local leaders who violated monopoly agreements, and destroy entire spice plantations if producers attempted to sell to non-Dutch buyers. The company's organizational structure reflected this commitment to using corporate resources for imperial objectives. The VOC maintained separate administrative departments for military operations, diplomatic relations, territorial governance, and commercial activities. Company officials received training in warfare, negotiation, and administration comparable to education provided for government diplomatic personnel. Most importantly, the VOC established permanent institutions in Asia, rather than temporary trading expeditions that returned to Europe after completing individual voyages. They built administrative centers, military installations, shipyards, and warehouses designed to support indefinite corporate operations throughout the Indonesian archipelago and beyond. The company headquarters in Batavia, modern Jakarta, established in 1619, became the administrative center for corporate operations spanning from Japan to the Cape of Good Hope. This wasn't just a trading post, It was the capital of a corporate empire that governed millions of people across thousands of miles of territory. VOC operations differed fundamentally from traditional European colonization in several crucial ways. Traditional colonies were governed by appointed officials who served royal interests and reported to European monarchs. VOC territories were governed by company employees who served shareholder interests and reported to corporate directors in Amsterdam. Traditional colonies extracted wealth to support royal treasuries and national power. VOC territories extracted wealth to generate dividend payments and increase stock prices for private investors. Most importantly, traditional colonies attempted to balance commercial extraction with obligations to protect colonized populations and maintain social stability. VOC territories prioritized profit maximization regardless of human consequences, treating local populations as economic resources rather than governmental responsibilities. This corporate approach to colonization proved remarkably efficient. VOC operations generated consistent profits, while traditional government colonies frequently operated at losses. VOC territories expanded through strategic commercial calculation, while traditional colonies expanded through royal ambition that often exceeded available resources. By 1620, the VOC controlled spice production throughout the Indonesian archipelago, maintained trading posts from India to Japan, and generated annual profits that exceeded the governmental revenues of most European nations. They had achieved something unprecedented: total corporate control over intercontinental trade that generated extraordinary profits for private shareholders while establishing political authority over vast foreign territories. But this success was only the beginning. The VOC had discovered that private corporations could achieve imperial power more efficiently than traditional governments if they were willing to use unlimited violence in pursuit of unlimited profits. They were about to demonstrate that corporate colonialism could be far more brutal and extractive than anything European monarchs had previously attempted. The world's first multinational corporation was ready to show how systematic corporate brutality could generate shareholder returns that made traditional royal treasuries seem modest by comparison. The age of corporate empire was about to begin. Chapter 1. Corporate Birth, March 20th, 1602. In a modest chamber within Amsterdam's City Hall, 7 Dutch merchants signed documents that would reshape global commerce forever. The Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company, officially became the world's first multinational corporation with sovereign powers to wage war, establish colonies, and govern foreign populations. But this wasn't just another trading venture. The VOC represented something unprecedented: a profit-driven organization that could function as an independent nation-state while serving private shareholders rather than royal interests. The 6 competing Dutch companies that merged to create the VOC had been destroying each other's profits through chaotic competition in Asian markets. The Amsterdam Company, the Zeeland Company, the Delft Company, the Rotterdam Company, the Hoorn Company, and the Enkhuizen Company had all discovered that Indonesian spices could generate extraordinary profits if they could eliminate competition from each other and foreign merchants. Dirk van Os, representing the Amsterdam Company, had accumulated detailed intelligence about the competitive problems facing Dutch merchants. Our individual expeditions generate 300 to 400% profits when successful, but Portuguese competitors control the best ports. English merchants are expanding their operations, and local rulers demand increasingly expensive terms because they can play Dutch companies against each other. The solution required unprecedented coordination among Dutch commercial interests. Rather than continuing to compete destructively, they would merge their capital, expertise, and political influence to create a single organization capable of achieving total monopoly control over Asian spice production. The negotiation process revealed the sophisticated financial thinking that would make the VOC successful. Each component company contributed assets, ships, capital, trading expertise, and political connections in exchange for shares in the combined organization. The final ownership structure allocated shares based on each company's contributed assets, while ensuring that no single region could dominate corporate decision-making. Amsterdam merchants controlled 57% of VOC shares, reflecting their superior capital and maritime expertise. Zeeland merchants controlled 20%, Delft and Rotterdam merchants controlled 14%, and Hoorn and Enkhuizen merchants controlled 9%. This distribution ensured Amsterdam leadership, while maintaining sufficient regional participation to secure political support throughout the Dutch Republic. More importantly, the Charter established revolutionary principles of corporate governance that would influence business organization for centuries. Shareholders could buy and sell their stakes without requiring approval from other owners. Company management was delegated to professional administrators who reported to elected directors rather than individual shareholders. Most significantly, shareholders enjoyed limited liability protection, meaning their personal assets couldn't be seized to pay corporate debts or cover damages caused by corporate activities. This limited liability provision was crucial for attracting investment in an enterprise that planned to use systematic violence to achieve commercial objectives. Wealthy Dutch families could invest in VOC operations without risking their personal fortunes if corporate military activities resulted in expensive legal consequences or diplomatic retaliation. The initial capital subscriptions revealed the extraordinary confidence Dutch investors placed in this new corporate model. The VOC raised 6,424,588 guilders during its initial stock offering, roughly equivalent to $110 million today. This was more capital than any previous commercial expedition had attempted to raise, more than most European governments controlled, and sufficient to finance simultaneous operations throughout Asia. But capital alone wouldn't ensure success against established competitors. The VOC needed systematic advantages that would allow them to outcompete Portuguese merchants who had controlled Asian trade routes for over a century, English merchants who were aggressively expanding their operations, and local Asian traders who understood regional markets better than any European competitors. The strategic plan developed by the VOC directors was breathtakingly comprehensive. They would establish permanent administrative centers in key Asian locations rather than relying on temporary trading expeditions. They would negotiate exclusive treaties with local rulers that prevented these rulers from trading with competing merchants. They would build fortifications that could protect Dutch facilities while preventing competitors from establishing rival operations nearby. Most importantly, they would maintain sufficient military force to eliminate any opposition to Dutch commercial monopoly through direct violence when necessary. Here in 16th, the 17 directors who governed VOC operations received detailed reports about Portuguese and English commercial activities throughout Asia. These reports identified specific vulnerabilities that Dutch military and commercial superiority could exploit to gain decisive advantages over existing competitors. Portuguese operations depended on a small number of fortified ports connected by vulnerable shipping routes. Portuguese merchants maintained cordial relationships with some local rulers but lacked sufficient military force to impose their commercial preferences when local interests conflicted with Portuguese objectives. English operations remained limited in scope and financial resources. The English East India Company operated with roughly 1/10 the capital that the VOC commanded, maintained minimal military capabilities, and focused primarily on Indian markets rather than the more profitable Indonesian spice trade. Most encouraging from a Dutch perspective, neither Portuguese nor English merchants had established systematic control over spice production itself. They purchased spices from local producers who remained free to negotiate with competing buyers, creating opportunities for Dutch merchants to offer better terms that would redirect spice supplies toward Dutch-controlled distribution networks. The VOC's first strategic objective was establishing permanent control over the Spice Islands, the Banda and Molucca Islands, where nutmeg, mace, and cloves grew naturally and couldn't be cultivated elsewhere. Whoever controlled these islands could dictate global prices for the world's most valuable agricultural products. Peter Both, appointed as the first Governor-General, received explicit authorization to achieve this control through whatever methods proved necessary. His instructions, preserved in VOC archives, reveal the company's willingness to use unlimited violence in pursuit of commercial objectives. You are authorized to negotiate exclusive trading agreements with local rulers using financial incentives, political pressure, or military force as circumstances require. Rulers who cooperate will receive protection and economic benefits. Rulers who resist will face consequences until cooperation is achieved. The VOC equipped Booth's expedition with unprecedented resources for a commercial venture. 12 warships carrying 1,000 soldiers, plus construction materials for building permanent fortifications, administrative supplies for establishing colonial governments, and negotiating gifts valued at over 200,000 guilders. This wasn't a trading expedition. It was a corporate invasion designed to establish permanent Dutch control over Asian territories that would serve as profit-generating assets for private shareholders. The expedition's departure from Amsterdam in December 1603 marked a fundamental transformation in the relationship between commerce and political power. Previous European trading expeditions had operated under royal authority and served national interests. The VOC expedition operated under corporate authority and served shareholder interests. Previous expeditions had accepted existing patterns of Asian trade and attempted to participate profitably within established commercial relationships. The VOC expedition intended to destroy existing patterns of Asian trade and create new commercial relationships that would serve Dutch monopoly interests exclusively. Most importantly, previous expeditions had viewed local Asian populations as potential trading partners who possessed valuable products. The VOC expedition viewed local Asian populations as obstacles to corporate control, who needed to be eliminated, subordinated, or incorporated into Dutch-controlled production systems. Amsterdam's stock exchange celebrated the expedition's departure with significant increases in VOC share prices. Dutch investors anticipated extraordinary profits from corporate operations that would combine the most advanced European military technology with the most systematic commercial planning that any business organization had ever attempted. But the VOC was about to discover that achieving corporate control over Asian territories would require levels of violence that exceeded anything European merchants had previously attempted. Local rulers would not voluntarily surrender their commercial independence to serve Dutch shareholder interests. Asian producers would not willingly accept Dutch monopoly control over their traditional livelihood activities. The world's first multinational corporation was about to learn that building a corporate empire required corporate armies, willing to wage corporate wars against entire populations who refused to accept corporate domination disguised as commercial cooperation. Chapter 2. Spice Wars. The VOC's first military operation revealed the brutal reality of corporate empire. When local populations refused to serve shareholder interests, systematic violence became standard business practice. February 1609. Governor-General Peter Booth anchored his fleet outside Banda, the administrative center of the Banda Islands, where the world's entire supply of nutmeg and mace was produced by roughly 15,000 indigenous inhabitants who had maintained their independence for centuries. The Bandanese had every reason to reject Dutch commercial demands. They had prospered for generations by selling nutmeg to multiple buyers, Portuguese, English, Chinese, and Javanese merchants who competed for access to Bandanese spices by offering favorable terms and respecting local autonomy. VOC proposals would eliminate this competition while establishing Dutch monopoly control over Bandanese economic activity. Chief Orang Kaya welcomed the Dutch delegation with traditional hospitality, but firmly rejected their commercial proposals. The nutmeg trees belong to our ancestors and our children. We will continue selling our spices to whoever offers fair prices and honest treatment. No foreign merchants will control what we produce on our own land. Booth's response revealed the VOC's willingness to use military force against populations who refused to accept corporate control. The Dutch Republic has invested substantial resources in establishing commercial operations throughout the Indonesian archipelago. Local rulers who cooperate with Dutch commercial objectives will receive protection and economic benefits. Local rulers who oppose Dutch commercial objectives will face military consequences until cooperation is achieved. What Booth called military consequences was systematic terrorism designed to force Bandanese submission through psychological fear rather than traditional military conquest. VOC forces didn't attempt to occupy Bandanese territory. They demonstrated their capacity to destroy Bandanese society whenever Bandanese leaders refused to comply with Dutch demands. The siege of Banda lasted 6 months and established tactics that the VOC would use throughout their empire-building operations. Dutch warships blockaded the islands to prevent food imports and spice exports. Dutch landing parties burned nutmeg plantations and destroyed food crops to create artificial famine conditions. Dutch soldiers captured Bandanese leaders and executed them publicly to demonstrate the consequences of opposing Dutch commercial interests. Most importantly, Dutch forces deliberately targeted civilians to maximize psychological pressure on Bandanese political leaders. Women, children, and elderly residents faced systematic brutalization, designed to convince Bandanese leadership that continued resistance would result in complete social destruction. Dr. François Caron, serving as a VOC medical officer, documented the deliberate nature of Dutch terror tactics in his confidential reports. Our military operations prioritize civilian terror over traditional battlefield success. Bandanese military forces remain capable of organized resistance, but Bandanese political leaders cannot maintain popular support when resistance results in systematic civilian casualties. The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. Bandanese leaders faced an impossible choice: continue resisting Dutch demands while watching their people suffer and die, or surrender Bandanese independence to protect their population from further Dutch violence. In August 1609, surviving Bandanese leaders signed the Treaty of Banda that granted the VOC exclusive rights to purchase all nutmeg and mace produced in the Banda Islands at prices determined by Dutch officials. Bandanese producers could not sell to non-Dutch buyers, could not negotiate alternative terms, and faced execution for violating monopoly agreements. The treaty transformed independent Bandanese producers into enslaved suppliers for a Dutch corporate monopoly, while providing legal justification for continued Dutch military control over Bandanese territory. But the VOC discovered that signing treaties didn't eliminate local resistance. It simply changed the forms that resistance took. Bandanese producers attempted to smuggle spices to non-Dutch buyers who offered higher prices. Bandanese leaders sought military assistance from Portuguese and English merchants who had their own commercial interests in breaking Dutch monopoly control. Even individual Bandanese families tried to conceal spice production to avoid Dutch taxation and regulation. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, appointed as Governor-General in 1618, concluded that partial control over spice production was insufficient for maximizing corporate profits. Complete control required eliminating the Bandanese population entirely and replacing them with enslaved laborers who would have no choice but to serve Dutch interests. His proposal to the Heeren 17th was explicit in its genocidal intentions. Bandanese resistance continues despite our treaty obligations and military demonstrations. Complete profit maximization requires systematic population replacement that will eliminate future resistance while ensuring absolute corporate control over nutmeg production. The director's response, preserved in company archives, revealed how corporate profit calculations could justify unlimited violence. Governor-General Cohen is authorized to implement whatever population control measures prove necessary for securing permanent Dutch commercial advantages in the Banda Islands. Long-term profit maximization requires permanent solutions to local resistance problems. What the directors euphemistically called population control measures was systematic genocide designed to create optimal conditions for corporate profit extraction. The Banda genocide began in May 1621 and continued for 3 months until the indigenous population had been essentially eliminated. VOC forces systematically murdered Bandanese men, enslaved Bandanese women and children, and destroyed all evidence of pre-Dutch Bandanese civilization. Archaeological excavations conducted in the 20th century found mass graves containing thousands of skeletal remains from this period. Cohen's personal letters reveal the calculated nature of corporate genocide. We have achieved complete elimination of Bandanese resistance through systematic population replacement. Banda Islands now generate maximum profits with minimum security concerns. Similar operations should be implemented wherever local populations interfere with corporate commercial objectives. The replacement population consisted of enslaved workers imported from Java, Chinese indentured laborers, and Dutch colonial settlers who received land grants in exchange for managing spice plantations according to corporate specifications. This new population had no historical connection to the Banda Islands, no alternative economic opportunities, and no ability to resist Dutch corporate control. The economic results exceeded even the most optimistic corporate projections. Nutmeg production under direct Dutch control increased 340% within 5 years, as enslaved workers could be forced to work longer hours, tend larger plantations, and accept subsistence-level living conditions that free Bandanese producers would never have accepted. More importantly, eliminating local population eliminated local resistance to corporate price manipulation. The VOC could restrict nutmeg exports to European markets to create artificial scarcity that drove prices to unprecedented levels. Nutmeg, that cost 1 guilder to produce in Dutch-controlled plantations, sold for 300 guilders in European markets. Corporate shareholders celebrated these results as brilliant business strategy that demonstrated the superiority of systematic planning over chaotic competition. VOC stock prices increased 190% between 1621 and 1625, as investors realized that corporate genocide could generate extraordinary returns on investment. The success in Banda convinced VOC leadership that similar methods could be applied throughout the Indonesian archipelago to achieve total corporate control over spice production. Local rulers throughout the Moluccas, Celebes, and Java would face the same choice: voluntarily surrender their independence to serve Dutch commercial interests, or face systematic elimination followed by population replacement with more cooperative workers. Chief Merchant Isaac Lemaire wrote in his confidential report to Amsterdam shareholders, "Our Banda operations demonstrate that systematic violence can achieve commercial objectives more efficiently than traditional negotiation or limited military pressure. Local populations that cannot be profitably incorporated into corporate production systems should be eliminated to prevent future resistance problems." The VOC had discovered something that would influence corporate behavior for centuries. When profit maximization conflicted with human survival, corporate interests could justify unlimited violence against civilian populations who interfered with shareholder returns. But the Banda genocide was only the beginning. The VOC was about to discover that controlling spice production was just the first step toward building a corporate empire that could generate profits from systematic exploitation of entire continents. The world's most profitable corporation was ready to demonstrate how corporate armies could achieve imperial conquest more efficiently than traditional royal forces, how corporate administrators could extract wealth more systematically than traditional colonial governors, and how corporate shareholders could celebrate mass murder as successful business strategy. The spice wars had established the precedent. Human lives were acceptable casualties for corporate profit maximization. Chapter 3: Armed Trading. By 1625, the VOC had transformed from a trading company into a military organization that used armed force as its primary business strategy. Corporate executives discovered that owning warships was more profitable than negotiating with foreign competitors. The company's military expansion was staggering in scope. VOC naval forces grew from 12 ships in 1603 to 150 warships by 1630, a fleet larger than most European navies. These weren't converted merchant vessels equipped with defensive weapons. They were purpose-built warships designed for aggressive military operations against competing merchants, resistant local rulers, and any other obstacles to Dutch commercial monopoly. The fleet included 40 ships of the line armed with heavy cannons, capable of destroying coastal fortifications, 60 frigates designed for fast attacks against merchant shipping, and 50 smaller vessels optimized for operations in shallow Asian waters where Portuguese and English competitors maintained trading posts. More importantly, VOC warships operated under corporate rather than national authority. Ship commanders received orders from company executives in Batavia rather than government officials in Amsterdam. Military operations served shareholder interests rather than national strategic objectives. Naval victories generated corporate profits rather than royal glory. Admiral Cornelis Matyliev, commanding the VOC fleet, understood that corporate naval power served different objectives than traditional royal navies. Our fleet exists to eliminate commercial competition through military superiority. We attack merchant shipping, destroy competitors' facilities, and blockade ports that refuse to accept Dutch commercial terms. Traditional naval warfare between royal fleets is irrelevant to our corporate objectives. The strategic doctrine was remarkably systematic. VOC forces would identify profitable trade routes where competing merchants operated. They would demand exclusive trading rights from local authorities while positioning warships to blockade local ports if these demands were rejected. If local rulers refused to grant monopoly privileges, VOC forces would demonstrate their military capability through selective violence until cooperation was achieved. If competing European merchants attempted to maintain operations in Dutch-controlled areas, VOC forces would attack their facilities, capture their ships, and imprison their personnel until these competitors abandoned their Asian operations entirely. The attack on Portuguese Macau in 1622 demonstrated how corporate military power could eliminate established competitors through systematic violence. Portuguese merchants had controlled Macau for over 70 years, maintaining cordial relationships with Chinese authorities while generating substantial profits from China-Europe trade. VOC commanders identified Macau as a threat to Dutch commercial expansion because Portuguese control over Chinese trade routes limited Dutch opportunities for profitable operations in Chinese markets. The corporate solution was direct military assault, designed to eliminate Portuguese presence in Chinese waters. Admiral Piet Hein led 22 VOC warships against Macau's Portuguese defenders, who possessed only 8 lightly armed vessels and minimal coastal fortifications. The battle lasted 6 hours and resulted in complete Portuguese defeat. VOC forces captured Portuguese facilities, confiscated Portuguese assets, and expelled Portuguese merchants from all Chinese trading operations. But VOC forces didn't attempt to occupy Macau permanently. Instead, they demanded that Chinese authorities grant exclusive trading privileges to Dutch merchants while prohibiting Portuguese commercial activities in Chinese waters. Chinese officials, having witnessed VOC military capabilities, agreed to Dutch demands rather than risk similar military pressure against Chinese cities. The Macau victory achieved multiple corporate objectives simultaneously. It eliminated Portuguese competition from Chinese markets. It demonstrated VOC military superiority to Chinese authorities. Most importantly, it established the precedent that corporate military force could coerce foreign governments into granting commercial privileges that served Dutch shareholder interests. Corporate shareholders celebrated the Macau victory as brilliant strategic planning that increased company assets while decreasing future competition. VOC stock prices increased 45% following news of the Portuguese defeat, as investors realized that systematic military aggression could generate superior returns compared to traditional commercial negotiation. The English East India Company faced similar corporate military pressure when they attempted to establish competing operations in Indonesian waters. English merchants had maintained a trading post at Bantam in Java since 1602, generating modest profits from pepper exports while maintaining peaceful relationships with local Javanese rulers. VOC executives identified English operations at Bantam as unacceptable competition that reduced Dutch profit margins while providing encouragement to other potential competitors who might attempt to challenge Dutch monopoly control over Indonesian spice production. Jan Pieter Soen Cohen, serving as Governor-General, ordered direct military action against English facilities. English commercial activities at Bantam violate our exclusive trading agreements with Javanese authorities. English merchants will be expelled from all Indonesian territories to prevent future interference with Dutch commercial operations. The attack on Bantam occurred in December 1623 and demonstrated the systematic nature of VOC corporate violence. Dutch forces didn't simply capture English facilities, they implemented systematic terror designed to prevent any future English attempts to establish competing operations in Indonesian markets. VOC soldiers captured 20 English merchants and tortured them publicly, before executing them for violating Dutch commercial privileges. They burned English facilities completely to ensure they couldn't be restored. They imposed collective punishment on Javanese officials who had permitted English commercial activities, executing local leaders who had cooperated with English merchants. Most importantly, they circulated detailed accounts of English suffering throughout the Indonesian archipelago to ensure that other local rulers understood the consequences of permitting non-Dutch commercial activities in their territories. The psychological impact was exactly what VOC leadership intended. Local rulers throughout Indonesia voluntarily expelled competing European merchants rather than risk similar Dutch military retaliation. English, Portuguese, and Spanish trading operations collapsed throughout the Indonesian archipelago as local authorities refused to provide protection against Dutch corporate violence. Gabriel Towson, the English chief merchant at Bantam, wrote in his final letter before his execution, "The Dutch have transformed commercial competition into systematic warfare where no quarter is given and no mercy is shown. They seek not just commercial advantage, but complete elimination of all competing interests through unlimited violence." The English East India Company responded by withdrawing from Indonesian markets entirely, concentrating their operations in India, where they hoped to avoid direct confrontation with superior Dutch military capabilities. This strategic retreat left the VOC with complete monopoly control over the world's most valuable spice-producing territories. By 1630, VOC corporate military forces had achieved something unprecedented: systematic elimination of European commercial competition throughout the Indonesian archipelago through coordinated military operations that served private shareholder interests rather than national strategic objectives. The company's military success created new operational challenges that required additional institutional development. VOC territories now included millions of inhabitants who needed to be governed according to corporate rather than traditional political objectives. Local populations needed to be organized to serve Dutch commercial interests while preventing resistance that could threaten corporate profit extraction. The solution was developing corporate governmental institutions that could administer conquered territories more efficiently than traditional colonial administrations operated by European monarchs. VOC territories would be governed by company employees who reported to corporate executives rather than royal officials who served national interests. This corporate colonialism would prove more extractive and brutal than anything European kings had previously attempted, because corporate administrators served shareholder profit maximization rather than royal obligations to protect colonized populations. The armed trading phase had accomplished its strategic objectives. The VOC now controlled territory, populations and resources sufficient to generate extraordinary profits for Dutch shareholders while preventing any meaningful competition from foreign merchants or resistant local rulers. But controlling territory was only the beginning. The company now needed to develop systematic methods for extracting maximum wealth from conquered populations while maintaining military control over vast areas of foreign territory using limited Dutch personnel and resources. The VOC was about to discover that building a corporate empire was easier than operating it profitably over long periods, while preventing local resistance from destroying corporate infrastructure and eliminating corporate personnel. Chapter 4: Island Empire. By 1640, the VOC controlled an empire spanning 15,000 miles from the Cape of Good Hope to the islands of Japan, territory larger than Europe, governed entirely by corporate executives serving private shareholder interests rather than royal authority. The administrative center in Batavia had become the capital of a commercial empire that governed over 3 million people across hundreds of islands, port cities, and trading posts. But this wasn't traditional European colonialism, where royal governors served national interests while maintaining some obligation to protect colonized populations. This was corporate colonialism, where company officials served shareholder profit maximization as their sole administrative objective. Governor-General Antonio van Diemen received explicit instructions from the Heeren 17th that revealed the fundamental difference between corporate and royal colonialism. All administrative decisions will prioritize long-term profit maximization for company shareholders. Local populations will be organized to serve corporate commercial objectives. Resources will be extracted to generate maximum returns on invested capital. Local customs, traditional authorities, and indigenous institutions will be maintained only when they serve corporate interests. The corporate empire was organized according to rational business principles rather than traditional governmental structures. The Indonesian archipelago was divided into administrative regions based on economic productivity rather than cultural or political boundaries. Each region was assigned production quotas for specific commodities, spices, rice, timber, minerals, that reflected corporate assessment of local economic potential. Regional administrators received annual performance evaluations based on their success in maximizing economic extraction while minimizing administrative expenses. Administrators who exceeded production quotas received bonuses and promotions. Administrators whose regions failed to meet corporate expectations faced dismissal or reassignment to less profitable territories. The Molucca Islands, controlled directly by VOC administrative personnel, demonstrate how corporate colonialism prioritized profit extraction over human welfare. The indigenous population had been largely eliminated during the conquest phase and replaced with enslaved workers imported from Java, Chinese indentured laborers, and Dutch colonial settlers who managed spice plantations according to corporate specifications. The replacement population worked under conditions that would have been impossible to impose on free indigenous inhabitants. Enslaved workers labored 14 hours daily during harvest seasons, received subsistence rations calculated to maintain work capacity while minimizing food costs, and lived in company-provided housing designed for maximum occupancy rather than human comfort. Company medical officers monitored worker health, not from humanitarian concern, but to optimize labor productivity. Dr. Johannes van den Bosch reported to Batavia administrators, reducing worker food rations below current levels would decrease productivity more than it would reduce costs. Current rationing represents optimal balance between maintaining work capacity and minimizing feeding expenses. The corporate approach to worker management reflected systematic calculation designed to extract maximum labor value while minimizing human resource costs. Workers who became too sick or injured to maintain productivity were replaced rather than treated. Workers who attempted to escape plantation labor faced execution as examples to discourage resistance among remaining workers. Spice production under corporate control exceeded all previous levels because enslaved workers could be forced to work longer hours, tend larger plantations, and accept living conditions that free producers would never have tolerated. Clove production in the Moluccas increased 280% between 1630 and 1650, while production costs decreased 60% due to systematic exploitation of unpaid labor. The economic efficiency was extraordinary by contemporary standards. Corporate administrators had achieved something that traditional royal colonies had never accomplished: profitable extraction that consistently generated returns exceeding administrative costs, while maintaining absolute control over large indigenous populations. But the most innovative aspect of VOC corporate colonialism was the systematic integration of conquered territories into a unified commercial empire designed to maximize profits through coordinated economic planning rather than independent territorial exploitation. Java provided rice and manual labor for spice plantations in the Moluccas. Ceylon provided cinnamon and precious stones for export to European markets. India provided textiles and manufactured goods for trade throughout the Indonesian archipelago. The Cape Colony provided food and supplies for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. Each territory was assigned specific economic functions within the larger corporate empire, based on local resource availability and production capabilities. This vertical integration allowed the VOC to control every stage of production and distribution, while minimizing costs through internal coordination rather than market purchases. The administrative integration required unprecedented coordination among corporate officials scattered across 3 continents. Monthly reports from regional administrators provided detailed information about local economic conditions, production capabilities, security situations, and opportunities for expanding corporate operations. Annual conferences brought together senior administrators from throughout the empire to coordinate economic planning, share administrative innovations, and develop strategies for managing local populations more efficiently. These corporate conferences functioned as business meetings focused on profit maximization rather than governmental councils concerned with administrative justice or population welfare. The corporate empire's legal system reflected the same priorities. VOC territories operated under company law designed to serve corporate interests rather than traditional colonial law that attempted to balance European and indigenous legal traditions. Company officials served as judges in legal proceedings that prioritized protecting corporate property and maintaining labor discipline over resolving disputes between individuals. Legal penalties reflected corporate cost-benefit calculations rather than traditional concepts of proportional punishment. Theft of company property resulted in execution because allowing such theft would encourage additional theft that could damage corporate profitability. Resistance to work assignments resulted in physical punishment sufficient to discourage similar resistance among other workers. Local populations learned that their survival depended on serving corporate interests rather than maintaining traditional social relationships or cultural practices. Traditional leaders retained ceremonial authority only when they helped enforce corporate labor requirements and production quotas. Traditional religious practices continued only when they didn't interfere with work schedules or challenge corporate authority. The psychological impact was devastating, but economically efficient. Local populations focused their energy on meeting corporate expectations rather than maintaining traditional social institutions that could provide foundations for organized resistance against corporate control. Chinese merchant communities throughout the VOC empire adapted to corporate colonialism by serving as intermediaries between Dutch administrators and local populations. Chinese merchants managed local commerce according to VOC regulations while providing cultural translation services that helped Dutch officials understand local conditions and manage local populations more effectively. This collaboration was mutually beneficial for Chinese merchants and Dutch administrators, while being devastating for indigenous populations who found themselves governed by foreign authorities who communicated through foreign intermediaries who had no cultural connection to local traditions or population welfare. By 1660, the VOC empire had achieved systematic integration that allowed coordinated economic planning across vast distances while maintaining absolute control over millions of people through minimal Dutch personnel. The entire empire was administered by fewer than 3,000 Dutch officials who supervised millions of workers, soldiers, and local administrators who served corporate objectives. The administrative efficiency was unprecedented in the history of European colonialism. Previous colonial empires required expensive military occupation, extensive governmental bureaucracy, and substantial financial subsidies from European royal treasuries. The VOC empire generated consistent profits while paying for its own administrative costs and military expenses. Corporate shareholders enjoyed extraordinary returns on their investments, while Dutch government avoided the expenses associated with traditional colonial administration. The VOC had demonstrated that corporate colonialism could be more profitable and efficient than royal colonialism if corporate administrators were willing to prioritize profit maximization over human welfare. But the corporate empire was about to face challenges that would test whether business efficiency could maintain long-term control over populations who increasingly understood that corporate colonialism offered them nothing except permanent exploitation disguised as economic development. Local resistance was beginning to emerge among populations who had learned that serving corporate interests provided no pathway to improved living conditions or cultural autonomy. The island empire had achieved maximum efficiency in profit extraction. Now it would discover whether efficient extraction could be sustained indefinitely against populations who had no stake in corporate success and every reason to support corporate failure. Chapter 5. Global Monopoly. Between 1650 and 1700, the VOC achieved something unprecedented in economic history: near-complete monopoly control over global trade in the world's most valuable commodities while operating as a private corporation accountable only to shareholders rather than governmental oversight. The numbers reveal the extraordinary scope of corporate market manipulation. The VOC controlled 90% of global spice production, 70% of Asian textile exports to Europe, 60% of global coffee trade, and 40% of global sugar distribution. No government, royal dynasty, or religious institution had ever controlled such a large percentage of international commerce. More importantly, the VOC had learned to maximize profits through systematic market manipulation rather than simply controlling production. They could create artificial scarcity by restricting exports, manipulate prices by timing market entries, and eliminate competition through strategic dumping that destroyed competitors' financial viability. The spice markets demonstrate how corporate monopoly control enabled extraordinary price manipulation. Nutmeg that cost 1 guilder to produce in VOC plantations sold for 310 guilders in Amsterdam markets when the company restricted exports to maintain artificial scarcity. When Portuguese or English merchants attempted to compete with alternative spice sources, the VOC would flood European markets with low-priced spices until their competitors went bankrupt, then resume restriction policies that drove prices back to monopoly levels. Joan Matsuyker, serving as Governor-General from 1653 to 1678, perfected these market manipulation strategies. Our competitive advantage derives not from superior production efficiency, but from our ability to control market supply according to profit optimization calculations. We can destroy competing merchants by temporarily sacrificing profits, then recover these losses through monopoly pricing once competition has been eliminated. The psychological impact on European markets was exactly what the VOC intended. Merchants who attempted to compete with Dutch spice imports understood they faced an organization with sufficient resources to sustain temporary losses until competition was eliminated. Few merchants were willing to risk bankruptcy by challenging Dutch market control when they knew the VOC could outlast them financially. European governments began treating the VOC as a sovereign power rather than a private corporation, because the company's economic influence exceeded that of most European kingdoms. French Finance Minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert wrote in his confidential report to King Louis XIV, "The Dutch company controls European access to Asian commodities more completely than any European monarch controls domestic commerce. Their economic power requires diplomatic recognition comparable to that accorded to sovereign nations." The diplomatic recognition became explicit when European governments began negotiating formal treaties with VOC representatives rather than requiring Dutch government intermediation for commercial agreements. The Treaty of Breda, 1667, included specific provisions recognizing VOC territorial control over Indonesian islands. The Treaty of Westminster, 1674, acknowledged VOC authority to regulate English commercial activities in Asian waters. These treaty recognitions established legal precedents that would influence international law for centuries. Private corporations could achieve sovereign status through economic power, territorial control, and military capability regardless of formal governmental structures. But the VOC's global monopoly required constant enforcement against local populations who attempted to circumvent corporate control through smuggling, alternative production, or resistance to corporate labor requirements. The company discovered that maintaining monopoly control was more expensive and complex than achieving initial market dominance. The Clove Wars in the Moluccas demonstrate the systematic violence required to maintain corporate monopoly against local resistance. Indigenous populations had traditionally grown clove trees throughout the island chain, selling their harvests to various buyers who competed for access to local production. VOC monopoly policies required eliminating all clove production except in company-controlled plantations. Corporate officials ordered systematic destruction of clove trees, growing in areas outside direct VOC control. Company soldiers traveled throughout the Moluccas, cutting down thousands of clove trees to prevent local populations from maintaining independent spice production that could compete with corporate plantations. Local populations resisted these destruction orders because clove trees provided their primary source of income and had cultural significance as ancestral property passed down through generations. The resistance created ongoing military conflicts that required permanent VOC military occupation of spice-producing territories. Commander Arnold de Vlaming van Oudshoorn reported on the systematic nature of tree destruction operations. "We have destroyed approximately 65,000 clove trees across 17 islands to eliminate unauthorized spice production. Local resistance continues despite our military demonstrations, requiring ongoing military operations to maintain corporate monopoly control." The tree destruction campaigns achieved their economic objectives while creating permanent security problems throughout the VOC empire. Local populations understood that corporate monopoly policies threatened their traditional livelihoods and cultural practices, creating motivation for organized resistance that required expensive military responses. The coffee monopoly in Java reveals how corporate control could transform entire societies to serve shareholder interests while devastating local agricultural systems. Javanese farmers had traditionally grown rice for local consumption while cultivating coffee as a supplementary crop for additional income. VOC administrators imposed coffee cultivation quotas that required Javanese farmers to dedicate increasing percentages of their land to coffee production for corporate export, rather than rice production for local consumption. The quotas increased systematically as corporate demand for coffee exports grew in European markets. By 1680, many Javanese farming communities were required to dedicate 60% of their agricultural land to coffee production for VOC export, while importing rice from other regions to meet local food requirements. This agricultural transformation increased corporate profits while creating food dependency that made local populations vulnerable to famine whenever rice imports were disrupted. The systematic effects were devastating, but economically efficient from a corporate perspective. Javanese coffee production increased 400% between 1660 and 1700, while production costs remained minimal because farmers were required to provide labor and land without compensation beyond subsistence-level survival rations. Regional administrator Cornelis Spielman documented the calculated nature of agricultural transformation. Javanese coffee quotas have been increased to optimal levels, where further increases would create population unrest that would damage long-term production capabilities. Current quota levels generate maximum corporate profits while maintaining social stability sufficient for continued economic extraction. The global monopoly required sophisticated financial coordination to manage commercial operations spanning 3 continents while maintaining unified corporate policies that served Amsterdam shareholder interests. The VOC developed financial institutions that prefigured modern multinational corporation management systems. Regional treasuries maintained separate accounts for different commercial activities, while providing quarterly financial reports to Batavia headquarters. Annual consolidated reports provided comprehensive financial analysis that allowed corporate directors in Amsterdam to evaluate performance across all global operations. Currency management required coordination among dozens of different monetary systems, as the company operated in markets that used Chinese silver, Indian gold, European copper, and various local currencies. VOC financial officers developed exchange rate systems that allowed profitable currency arbitrage while facilitating commerce across different monetary zones. Most importantly, the company developed credit systems that allowed coordination of commercial activities across vast distances and long time periods. VOC letters of credit were accepted by merchants throughout Asia and Europe because the company's financial reputation exceeded that of most governmental treasuries. The financial innovations enabled commercial operations on scales that would have been impossible using traditional trading methods. The company could coordinate simultaneous operations in Japan, India, Indonesia, Ceylon, and South Africa, while maintaining unified financial control and strategic planning. By 1690, the VOC had achieved global economic integration that allowed systematic profit extraction from multiple continents, while providing Amsterdam shareholders with investment returns that exceeded 25% annually for over 30 consecutive years. Corporate executives had discovered that monopoly control over essential commodities could generate wealth that exceeded the treasuries of European kingdoms while operating with legal protection and political autonomy that traditional royal enterprises could never achieve. But the global monopoly was about to face challenges that would test whether corporate economic power could maintain long-term control over populations who increasingly understood that the VOC empire offered them only permanent exploitation disguised as commercial development. The monopoly had achieved maximum economic efficiency. Now it would discover whether economic efficiency could sustain indefinite political control over millions of people who had learned that corporate success required their permanent subordination. Chapter 6. Corporate Brutality. The VOC's systematic brutality wasn't an unfortunate side effect of commercial operations. It was a deliberate corporate policy designed to maximize shareholder profits through the systematic use of terror, torture, and mass murder against populations who interfered with business objectives. Corporate archives discovered in the 20th century reveal the calculated nature of VOC violence. Company officials didn't just permit brutality, they developed sophisticated policies for using systematic terror as a business tool to achieve commercial objectives more efficiently than traditional negotiation or economic incentives. The torture chambers in Batavia Castle served as the administrative center for coordinating systematic violence throughout the VOC empire. Company officials maintained detailed records of interrogation techniques, execution methods, and psychological warfare tactics that had proven most effective for extracting information, preventing resistance, and terrorizing local populations into compliance with corporate policies. Dr. Andreas Kleyer, serving as company physician in Batavia, documented interrogation procedures in his medical reports. Company interrogation methods have been systematically developed to maximize information extraction while minimizing time requirements. Physical torture techniques produce reliable results within 2 to 3 hours. Psychological pressure methods require 1 to 2 weeks, but generate more comprehensive intelligence about resistance networks. The systematic nature of corporate violence becomes clear in regional administrators' reports that treated brutality as a standard administrative tool comparable to taxation, labor management, or infrastructure development. Violence wasn't exceptional. It was routine corporate policy implemented according to standardized procedures developed through decades of experimentation. The Ambon massacre of 1623 demonstrates how corporate executives could order systematic mass murder to serve business objectives while maintaining detailed documentation that treated genocide as rational commercial strategy. English merchants had established a small trading post on Ambon Island where they competed with VOC operations by offering local producers higher prices for spice exports. From a commercial perspective, this competition reduced VOC profit margins and provided encouragement to other potential competitors who might challenge Dutch monopoly control. Governor-General Jan Pieter Cohen ordered elimination of English competition through systematic terror designed to prevent any future challenges to VOC commercial monopoly. English commercial activities on Ambon Island constitute unacceptable interference with company monopoly rights. All English personnel will be eliminated to demonstrate consequences of violating Dutch commercial privileges. The massacre was implemented according to detailed corporate procedures designed to maximize psychological impact while providing legal justification for company actions. VOC officials arrested English merchants on charges of conspiring against Dutch commercial interests, conducted formal legal proceedings that provided appearance of legitimate judicial process, then executed English personnel through torture methods designed to terrorize witnesses. Gabriel Towerson and 9 other English merchants were subjected to systematic torture before public execution to ensure that local witnesses understood the consequences of cooperating with competitors of Dutch corporate interests. The torture included waterboarding, limb crushing, and systematic burning designed to maximize suffering while prolonging consciousness. Local Ambonese officials who had permitted English commercial activities faced similar treatment as examples to other regional leaders who might consider allowing competing merchants to operate in their territories. The collective punishment extended to Ambonese civilian populations who had traded with English merchants. Commander Martinez Sonk documented the deliberate nature of civilian targeting. Our operations included systematic punishment of local populations who supported English commercial activities. Collective punishment serves important strategic objectives by ensuring that local populations understand their survival depends on exclusive cooperation with Dutch corporate interests. The psychological warfare extended throughout the Indonesian archipelago as VOC officials circulated detailed accounts of English suffering to ensure that other European merchants understood the consequences of attempting to establish competing operations in Dutch-controlled territories. The economic results exceeded corporate expectations. English operations throughout the Indonesian archipelago collapsed as local rulers refused to provide protection against Dutch retaliation. Portuguese and Spanish merchants similarly withdrew from Indonesian markets, rather than risk similar corporate violence. Corporate shareholders celebrated the massacre as brilliant strategic planning that eliminated competition while demonstrating corporate resolve to protect shareholder interests through unlimited violence. VOC stock prices increased 35% following news of the English elimination, as investors realized that systematic terrorism could generate superior returns compared to traditional commercial competition. The slave labor system in VOC territories reveals how corporate brutality could be systematically organized to serve profit maximization through the complete dehumanization of colonized populations. The company operated slave plantations throughout Ceylon, Java, and the Moluccas, where enslaved workers lived under conditions deliberately designed to maximize labor extraction while minimizing survival rates. Enslaved workers were treated as disposable economic resources whose deaths could be compensated through purchasing additional slaves rather than improving working conditions. Plantation administrator Willem van Horn documented the calculated approach to slave management. Optimal plantation profitability requires balancing slave purchase costs against productivity extraction. Current mortality rates of 40% annually represent acceptable levels given available slave replacement costs. Reducing mortality would require increased feeding and housing expenses that would exceed productivity benefits. Enslaved workers on spice plantations worked 16 hours daily during harvest seasons, while receiving food rations calculated to maintain work capacity rather than human health. Company medical officers monitored slave populations to optimize productivity rather than provide health care, recommending increased work requirements for slaves who appeared capable of additional labor output. The breeding programs for enslaved populations treated human reproduction as livestock management designed to produce workers with specific physical characteristics suitable for particular forms of plantation labor. Company officials maintained detailed records of slave genealogies to track inherited characteristics that enhanced productivity in different agricultural activities. Children born to enslaved parents became company property from birth, assigned to work duties appropriate to their physical development. Education was limited to job training necessary for plantation labor. Medical care was limited to interventions necessary for maintaining work capacity. The psychological control systems were designed to prevent organized resistance through systematic destruction of cultural identity, family relationships, and social institutions that could provide foundations for collective action against corporate authority. Enslaved populations were deliberately mixed to include people from different cultural backgrounds who couldn't communicate effectively with each other. Family relationships were systematically disrupted through forced relocations that separated spouses, parents, and children. Traditional cultural practices were prohibited when they created opportunities for social coordination that might threaten corporate control. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women provided both immediate gratification for Dutch colonial personnel and long-term economic benefits for corporate operations. Children born from these sexual relationships became company property while creating emotional bonds that could be exploited to control enslaved mothers who might otherwise resist corporate authority. Company officials understood that sexual violence served multiple corporate objectives, providing psychological rewards for Dutch personnel, producing additional enslaved workers, and creating emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited to maintain control over enslaved populations. Dr. Francois Valentine, serving as company chaplain, documented the systematic nature of sexual exploitation. Company policies regarding enslaved women serve important administrative functions by providing recreational benefits for Dutch personnel while producing additional workers for corporate operations. These policies require careful management to prevent conflicts among Dutch personnel while maximizing productivity benefits. The systematic nature of corporate brutality extended to indigenous populations who maintained nominal independence while being required to serve VOC commercial interests. Traditional rulers who cooperated with corporate demands received protection and limited autonomy. Traditional rulers who resisted corporate authority faced systematic elimination, followed by replacement with more cooperative leadership. The puppet ruler system allowed the VOC to maintain control over large populations using minimal Dutch personnel, while providing appearance of respecting local political traditions. Puppet rulers implemented corporate policies while accepting responsibility for local resistance that might require violent suppression. Local populations learned that their survival depended on serving corporate interests regardless of traditional political authority, cultural practices, or personal preferences. Corporate brutality had achieved its strategic objective: complete subordination of colonized populations who understood that resistance would result in systematic destruction of everything they valued. The brutality wasn't random violence. It was systematic terrorism designed to optimize corporate profit extraction through psychological control that made traditional military occupation unnecessary. The VOC had discovered that systematic brutality could achieve imperial control more efficiently than traditional colonial administration if corporate executives were willing to use unlimited violence against civilian populations. Chapter 7: Financial Innovation. The VOC didn't just dominate global trade, they invented the financial instruments and corporate structures that created modern capitalism. Every fundamental aspect of contemporary business, from stock markets to multinational corporations, originated from innovations developed to maximize profits from systematic colonial exploitation. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, established in 1602 specifically for VOC share trading, became the world's first modern financial market where ordinary citizens could buy ownership stakes in corporate enterprises. But this wasn't just convenient access to investment opportunities. It was a revolutionary transformation of economic relationships that allowed systematic wealth extraction to serve private investors rather than royal treasuries. Previous European trading expeditions had been financed by wealthy merchants or royal governments who directly controlled expedition operations and collected all profits. The VOC's joint stock structure meant that hundreds of investors could finance corporate operations while delegating operational control to professional managers who served shareholder interests collectively. This separation between ownership and management created unprecedented opportunities for systematic profit maximization because corporate executives could focus exclusively on generating returns for investors without considering governmental obligations, diplomatic consequences, or moral limitations that constrained royal colonial administrators. Isaac Lemaire, one of the original VOC shareholders, understood the revolutionary nature of this financial innovation. Our corporate structure allows systematic profit extraction without royal interference or moral constraints. Company executives serve shareholder wealth maximization as their sole obligation, enabling commercial strategies that traditional royal administrators could never implement. The initial public offering raised 6.4 million guilders from 143 individual shareholders, creating the first modern example of public participation in colonial enterprise. Ordinary Dutch citizens could purchase shares starting at 3,000 guilders, roughly equivalent to $35,000 today, allowing middle-class families to participate in colonial profit extraction while maintaining distance from actual colonial violence. The psychological impact was crucial for maintaining popular support for corporate brutality. Dutch shareholders could celebrate extraordinary dividend payments while remaining psychologically removed from the systematic violence that generated their investment returns. They were investors, not colonial administrators. They received profits, not responsibility for corporate crimes. VOC shares traded continuously on the Amsterdam Exchange, creating the world's first liquid market for corporate securities. Share prices fluctuated based on news from Asia, dividend announcements, and speculation about future corporate prospects. Daily trading volumes frequently exceeded 1,000 shares, generating substantial commission revenues for exchange operations. More importantly, share tradability meant that investors could profit from corporate violence without maintaining long-term commitment to colonial enterprise. Shareholders could purchase VOC stock when military victories promised increased profits, then sell their stakes if corporate brutality created political complications that threatened future returns. The dividend payments reveal the extraordinary profitability of systematic colonial exploitation. Between 1602 and 1650, VOC shareholders received annual dividend payments averaging 18% of their invested capital. During peak years, dividend payments exceeded 25% annually, returns that would make modern hedge fund managers weep with envy. These dividend payments were distributed in multiple forms to optimize tax efficiency and maintain investor enthusiasm. Cash dividends provided immediate returns. Stock dividends increased shareholders' ownership stakes in corporate assets. Special distributions included actual commodities, spices, textiles, precious metals, that shareholders could sell independently or retain as personal luxury goods. The accounting innovations developed to manage VOC operations established corporate financial practices that continue to influence modern business. The company maintained separate accounts for different geographical regions, different commodity types, and different operational activities. Quarterly financial reports provided detailed analysis of corporate performance across all global operations. Depreciation accounting allowed systematic recovery of capital investments in ships, buildings, and equipment over multi-year periods. Reserve accounting allowed allocation of profits to fund future military operations, territorial expansion, and unexpected operational expenses. Cost accounting provided detailed analysis of production expenses that enabled optimization of plantation operations and trading activities. Most importantly, the VOC developed transfer pricing systems that allowed profit optimization through internal transactions between different corporate divisions. Spices produced in company plantations could be sold to company trading divisions at prices that minimized taxation, while maximizing reported profits in jurisdictions with favorable tax treatment. These transfer pricing manipulations prefigured modern multinational corporation tax avoidance strategies, while providing legal mechanisms for extracting wealth from colonized territories without paying corresponding taxes to local governments or providing compensation to local populations. The credit systems developed to finance VOC operations created international financial networks that enabled commercial coordination across vast distances and long time periods. VOC letters of credit were accepted by merchants throughout Europe and Asia because the company's financial reputation exceeded that of most governmental treasuries. The credit networks enabled sophisticated commercial strategies that would have been impossible using traditional trading methods. The company could purchase Asian commodities using credit secured by anticipated European sales revenues. They could coordinate currency exchanges across multiple monetary systems while minimizing foreign exchange risks through hedging strategies. The insurance markets developed to protect VOC investments established risk management principles that continue to influence modern financial services. Lloyd's of London created specialized insurance policies for VOC shipping that protected against maritime losses while excluding coverage for damages caused by corporate military activities. The insurance exclusions were crucial for maintaining appearance of commercial legitimacy while providing legal protection for systematic corporate violence. Insurance covered losses from storms, pirates, or accidents, but not losses from corporate military operations against resistant local populations or competing European merchants. The banking relationships established to manage VOC finances created international financial connections that enabled wealth transfer from colonial territories to European financial centers. The Bank of Amsterdam, Wisselbank van Amsterdam, and various private banking houses provided currency exchange, international credit, and investment management services that converted colonial exploitation into European financial assets. These banking relationships were crucial for transforming systematic violence into respectable wealth that could be inherited by future generations without obvious connection to colonial brutality. Colonial profits could be invested in government bonds, real estate, or other European assets that provided steady returns while concealing their origins in systematic exploitation. The corporate legal innovations established precedents for limited liability that protected investors from personal responsibility for corporate crimes. Shareholders could profit from systematic brutality while maintaining legal protection against personal liability for damages caused by corporate operations. This limited liability principle was crucial for attracting investment in enterprises that used systematic violence to achieve commercial objectives. Wealthy Dutch families could invest in colonial exploitation without risking their personal assets if corporate military activities resulted in expensive legal consequences or diplomatic retaliation. The VOC's financial innovations also established precedents for corporate political influence that enabled systematic manipulation of governmental policy to serve private shareholder interests. Company executives maintained extensive political connections that influenced Dutch governmental policies regarding international trade, military support for corporate operations, and diplomatic recognition of corporate territorial control. This corporate political influence created systematic bias in governmental policy that prioritized private shareholder interests over national strategic objectives or moral obligations. Dutch governmental resources were systematically allocated to support corporate profit maximization rather than serve broader Dutch social interests. By 1650, the VOC's financial innovations had created a comprehensive system for converting systematic colonial violence into respectable European wealth, while providing legal protection and political support that enabled continued corporate brutality without meaningful accountability. The financial innovations weren't just clever accounting techniques, they were systematic methods for disguising corporate crimes as legitimate business activities while ensuring that profits from systematic exploitation would benefit European investors rather than the colonized populations who suffered to generate those profits. Modern capitalism inherited these financial structures, along with their moral blindness to the human consequences of systematic profit maximization. The VOC had created financial institutions that could celebrate extraordinary returns on investment while remaining psychologically and legally isolated from the violence required to generate those returns. The template was established. Financial innovation could make any level of systematic brutality appear legitimate if corporate executives were skilled enough at manipulating legal structures and accounting procedures. Chapter 8. Imperial Collapse. The VOC's downfall began with a fundamental contradiction. A private corporation could achieve imperial control through systematic violence, but maintaining that control required governmental resources that exceeded any corporation's financial capacity. By 1740, the company was governing over 4 million people across territory, spanning 3 continents, while facing increasingly sophisticated resistance that required military responses beyond corporate capabilities. Local populations had learned that VOC control offered them nothing except permanent exploitation, creating motivation for organized resistance that threatened corporate infrastructure throughout the empire. The Javanese War of Succession, 1741-1743, demonstrated how local resistance could exploit VOC vulnerabilities. Traditional Javanese rulers had initially cooperated with Dutch corporate control because cooperation provided protection against regional competitors while maintaining nominal political authority. But 40 years of corporate exploitation had taught Javanese leaders that VOC policies systematically destroyed traditional political institutions while extracting wealth that could have supported local development. Cooperation with corporate authority provided no pathway to improved conditions for Javanese populations or genuine autonomy for Javanese leadership. Prince Mas Said led Javanese resistance forces that understood how to exploit corporate weaknesses. Rather than confronting Dutch military superiority directly, Javanese resistance employed guerrilla tactics that disrupted corporate economic operations while avoiding decisive battles that would favor European military technology. Javanese forces targeted corporate infrastructure rather than Dutch military positions. They destroyed spice plantations, burned company warehouses, and captured VOC supply lines that connected administrative centers with outlying production facilities. These attacks damaged corporate profitability without requiring Javanese forces to defeat Dutch armies in direct combat. Most importantly, Javanese resistance received popular support because local populations understood that corporate defeat would eliminate the systematic exploitation that made their lives miserable. Javanese civilians provided intelligence, supplies, and personnel for resistance operations while maintaining appearance of cooperation with Dutch authorities. General Gustav Willem van Imhoff, commanding Dutch forces, recognized that corporate military resources were inadequate for suppressing popular resistance. Our military forces can control specific locations but cannot prevent ongoing resistance throughout territories where local populations support anti-Dutch activities. Corporate resources are insufficient for maintaining permanent military occupation capable of eliminating organized resistance. The resistance succeeded because it imposed costs on corporate operations that exceeded the profits those operations generated. Defending corporate facilities required permanent military forces that consumed resources without producing revenues. Rebuilding destroyed infrastructure required capital investments that reduced shareholder dividend payments. Most importantly, ongoing resistance discouraged investment in territorial expansion that had previously generated corporate growth. Corporate shareholders began questioning whether imperial control generated sufficient returns to justify the military expenses required for maintaining that control. VOC stock prices declined 40% between 1740 and 1750 as investors realized that corporate empire had become a financial liability rather than a profitable asset. The financial crisis was compounded by fundamental changes in global commerce that reduced the profitability of monopoly control over Asian commodities. Other European merchants had developed alternative supply sources for spices, textiles, and other goods that had previously generated extraordinary VOC profits. English merchants established spice plantations in their Caribbean colonies that produced cinnamon and nutmeg, comparable to Indonesian production. French merchants developed trading relationships with Indian textile producers that bypassed Dutch commercial networks. Spanish merchants expanded their Pacific operations to include direct trade between Asian producers and American markets. These alternative supply sources eliminated the artificial scarcity that had enabled VOC price manipulation while creating competitive pressure that reduced profit margins throughout Asian commerce. The company could no longer maintain monopoly pricing because customers had access to comparable products from multiple suppliers. The technological changes in European industry further reduced demand for Asian commodities that had generated VOC wealth. Synthetic dyes developed by European chemists replaced Asian textile colorings. European sugar plantations in the Caribbean produced cheaper sugar than Asian suppliers. European textile manufacturing reduced demand for Asian silk and cotton. Most importantly, European consumers developed preferences for new products, coffee, tea, chocolate, tobacco, that the VOC didn't control because these commodities were produced in regions outside the company's Asian empire. Corporate territorial control had become economically irrelevant as global commerce shifted toward commodities and regions that the company couldn't monopolize. The administrative challenges of governing vast territories with limited Dutch personnel created ongoing expenses that consumed corporate resources without generating corresponding revenues. The company employed over 12,000 European administrators across its Asian territories, while maintaining military forces exceeding 20,000 personnel required for internal security. These administrative and military expenses consumed over 60% of corporate revenues by 1750, leaving insufficient profits to maintain shareholder dividend payments at levels that justified continued investment in corporate shares. Many shareholders began selling their VOC stakes to purchase shares in other enterprises that generated superior returns without requiring imperial administration. The corruption among corporate officials created additional financial drains that reduced profits available for shareholder distribution. Regional administrators throughout the empire engaged in private trading activities that competed with official corporate commerce while using company resources and personnel for personal enrichment. Governor-General Jacob Mossel reported to Amsterdam directors, "Company officials throughout our territories engage in systematic private trading that reduces corporate revenues while increasing administrative expenses. Personal corruption has become so widespread that official corporate activities generate insufficient profits to cover operational costs." The corruption was systematic rather than exceptional because corporate officials understood that the VOC empire was declining and they needed to secure personal wealth before corporate collapse eliminated their opportunities for enrichment. Personal survival required exploiting corporate positions for individual benefit rather than serving shareholder interests that might disappear entirely. The political changes in Europe reduced governmental support for corporate imperial control. The Dutch Republic faced increasing military pressure from larger European powers that questioned Dutch territorial claims in Asia while challenging Dutch commercial privileges in European markets. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, Nessus 1780-1784, demonstrated how European conflicts could threaten corporate operations that depended on Dutch governmental protection. English naval forces captured numerous VOC facilities throughout Asia while disrupting shipping routes that connected different parts of the corporate empire. The war damages exceeded 43 million guilders, more than the company's entire annual revenue, while demonstrating that corporate territorial control was vulnerable to European military conflicts that the VOC couldn't influence or control. Corporate empire required governmental military support that the Dutch Republic could no longer provide reliably. The financial collapse became inevitable when corporate debt exceeded corporate assets, while shareholder confidence disappeared entirely. The company owed over 85 million guilders to creditors while controlling assets worth approximately 60 million guilders. Continued operations required capital infusions that shareholders were unwilling to provide. The Dutch government attempted to rescue corporate operations through financial subsidies and administrative reforms that would transform the VOC from a private corporation into a governmental, colonial administration. But these rescue attempts required governmental resources that the Dutch Republic couldn't afford, while eliminating the corporate autonomy that had enabled systematic profit extraction. On December 31, 1799, the VOC officially ceased operations and transferred all territorial control, military forces, and administrative responsibilities to the Dutch government. The world's first multinational corporation had collapsed after 197 years of operation that had generated extraordinary wealth for European shareholders while devastating Asian populations across 3 continents. The collapse wasn't caused by external military conquest or sudden economic catastrophe. It was caused by the internal contradictions of corporate imperialism that required governmental resources to maintain territorial control while generating profits that served private rather than governmental interests. The VOC had discovered that building a corporate empire was easier than sustaining it indefinitely against populations who understood that corporate success required their permanent subordination. The company's financial innovations, administrative techniques, and military strategies would influence European colonialism for centuries, but the fundamental lesson was clear. Private corporations could achieve temporary imperial control, but maintaining that control required governmental resources that exceeded corporate financial capabilities. The age of corporate empire had ended, but the precedents it established would shape colonial relationships until colonialism itself became politically unsustainable during the 20th century. Chapter 9. Modern Legacy. The VOC's corporate empire collapsed in 1799, but its business practices, legal innovations, and systematic approaches to profit maximization continue to shape modern capitalism in ways most people never recognize. Walk through the financial district of any major city today, New York, London, Tokyo, Singapore, and you're experiencing the direct descendant of systems the VOC created for extracting wealth from distant territories while providing legal protection for systematic exploitation disguised as legitimate business activity. Modern multinational corporations operate using organizational structures, accounting practices, and legal frameworks that trace directly to innovations developed for managing systematic colonial violence while maintaining shareholder profits. The limited liability that protects corporate investors from personal responsibility for corporate crimes. The transfer pricing that allows profit optimization through internal transactions between corporate divisions. The regulatory arbitrage that enables corporations to exploit differences between national legal systems. All of these contemporary business practices originated from techniques the VOC developed for maximizing colonial profit extraction while minimizing accountability for systematic brutality against colonized populations. Shell Oil, one of the world's largest corporations, directly inherited VOC business practices through institutional continuity that spans over 4 centuries. The Royal Dutch Shell Company emerged from the merger of Dutch and British oil companies that operated in former VOC territories using commercial networks, governmental relationships, and extraction techniques originally developed for spice trade. Shell's operations in Nigeria, Indonesia, and other developing nations employ systematic environmental destruction, political corruption, and military collaboration that parallels VOC methods for controlling local populations while extracting natural resources for European shareholders. The company maintains legal protection through corporate structures that insulate shareholders from responsibility for environmental damage or human rights violations. When Nigerian communities protested Shell's environmental destruction during the 1990s, the company collaborated with military forces that executed protest leaders using methods comparable to VOC suppression of resistance in 17th century Indonesia. Shell shareholders celebrated increased profits from Nigerian oil extraction while maintaining legal distance from systematic violence required to secure those profits. The modern banking system operates using financial innovations originally developed to launder VOC profits while providing investment opportunities for European shareholders who preferred not to acknowledge the systematic violence that generated their returns. ABN AMRO, ING Group, and other major European banks trace their institutional origins to financial houses that managed VOC wealth while providing credit for corporate military operations throughout Asia. These banks continue to provide financial services for corporations that employ systematic environmental destruction and labor exploitation in developing nations while offering socially responsible investment products that allow contemporary shareholders to maintain psychological distance from ongoing corporate crimes. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, where VOC shares first traded, established precedents for financial market operations that enable contemporary investors to profit from systematic exploitation while maintaining legal protection against personal liability for corporate brutality. Modern stock markets use sophisticated financial instruments to obscure the connection between investment returns and the systematic violence required to generate those returns. Contemporary shareholders can invest in defense contractors that manufacture weapons for systematic civilian killing, agricultural corporations that employ enslaved labor, and extractive industries that destroy indigenous communities, all while maintaining legal immunity and psychological distance from the human consequences of their investment decisions. The corporate legal system that protects modern multinational corporations from accountability for systematic crimes operates using principles originally developed to enable VOC profit extraction from colonial territories while preventing meaningful legal challenges from victimized populations. Corporate personhood, the legal fiction that treats corporations as individuals with constitutional rights, originated from precedents established when European governments recognized VOC sovereign authority over Asian territories. Contemporary corporations invoke constitutional protections against governmental regulation while claiming immunity from criminal prosecution for systematic environmental destruction, labor exploitation, and political corruption. The international trade system that enables contemporary corporations to exploit regulatory differences between national governments operates using frameworks originally developed to enable VOC circumvention of governmental oversight through strategic jurisdiction shopping. Modern corporations routinely establish subsidiaries in countries with minimal environmental regulation, weak labor protection, and limited legal oversight. Exactly as the VOC established operations in territories where European legal systems couldn't effectively regulate corporate behavior or protect local populations from systematic exploitation. The World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, and other international institutions that enforce corporate-friendly policies against resistant national governments employ systematic economic pressure comparable to VOC methods for coercing local rulers into accepting commercial arrangements that serve foreign shareholder interests rather than local population welfare. When developing nations attempt to regulate multinational corporations that employ systematic environmental destruction or labor exploitation, these international institutions impose economic sanctions that force policy changes favorable to corporate interests while maintaining appearance of legitimate international cooperation. The psychological techniques that enable contemporary consumers to celebrate low prices while ignoring the systematic exploitation required to provide those prices operate using mechanisms originally developed to enable VOC shareholders to enjoy extraordinary dividend payments while remaining psychologically isolated from colonial violence. Modern consumers can purchase products manufactured using enslaved labor, agricultural goods produced through systematic environmental destruction, and natural resources extracted through military collaboration, all while maintaining psychological comfort that their consumption choices represent legitimate market participation rather than complicity in ongoing corporate crimes. The supply chain complexity that obscures connections between final products and the systematic violence required for resource extraction employs techniques originally developed to enable VOC customers to purchase Asian commodities without acknowledging the genocide, slavery, and environmental destruction required for commodity production. The educational systems that teach business ethics, international development, and economic history consistently minimize or ignore the systematic violence that created contemporary corporate wealth while celebrating entrepreneurship, innovation, and free market competition as morally neutral or beneficial activities. Business schools throughout Europe and North America teach case studies based on VOC operations while focusing on organizational efficiency, strategic planning, and financial innovation without meaningful discussion of systematic violence against indigenous populations or ongoing human consequences of corporate wealth accumulation. This educational approach creates psychological conditions for accepting contemporary corporate crimes as inevitable business realities while providing professional training that enables participation in systematic exploitation disguised as legitimate career development. The most disturbing continuity involves corporate exploitation of indigenous populations who continue to face systematic violence for refusing to surrender their traditional territories to multinational corporations that extract natural resources for distant shareholders. Mining corporations in the Amazon, palm oil plantations in Indonesia, and natural gas extraction throughout Africa employ systematic violence against indigenous communities using methods directly comparable to VOC suppression of resistance in colonial territories. Indigenous populations who attempt to protect their traditional lands from corporate destruction face military forces equipped and trained by multinational corporations that collaborate with national governments to eliminate resistance through systematic terrorism, comparable to VOC operations throughout Asia. Contemporary corporate shareholders celebrate profits from extractive industries while maintaining legal protection and psychological distance from ongoing genocidal violence required to secure corporate access to indigenous territories and natural resources. The intellectual frameworks that enable corporate executives, government officials, and academic experts to justify contemporary systematic exploitation employ moral arguments originally developed to rationalize VOC colonial violence. Contemporary justifications for corporate exploitation emphasize economic development, technological progress, and market efficiency, exactly as VOC officials emphasized civilizing missions, commercial liberty, and beneficial cultural exchange to rationalize systematic genocide and environmental destruction. The moral blindness that enables educated professionals to participate in systematic exploitation while maintaining self-image as ethical people operates using psychological mechanisms originally developed to enable VOC shareholders and administrators to celebrate colonial wealth while ignoring colonial violence. The VOC established precedents that continue to shape global capitalism. Systematic violence could generate extraordinary profits if corporate executives were skilled enough at manipulating legal structures, financial instruments, and moral frameworks to disguise crimes as legitimate business activities. Modern capitalism inherited these precedents, along with institutional structures, financial innovations, and cultural assumptions that enable contemporary corporations to achieve systematic exploitation while maintaining legal protection and popular legitimacy. Understanding VOC precedents is essential for recognizing how contemporary corporate crimes operate and why legal, political, and educational institutions consistently fail to provide meaningful accountability for systematic corporate violence against vulnerable populations. The legacy isn't historical curiosity, it's the foundation that everything else is built on. Chapter 10. Corporate Lessons. The VOC's 200-year reign as the world's most powerful corporation offers crucial lessons about how systematic corporate power can undermine governmental authority, destroy democratic institutions, and create economic systems that prioritize shareholder profits over human survival. Modern policymakers, business leaders, and citizens ignore these lessons at their own peril because contemporary multinational corporations possess capabilities that exceed those available to the VOC while operating in global systems that provide even less meaningful oversight or accountability for corporate crimes. The first lesson concerns the relationship between corporate power and democratic governance. The VOC demonstrated that private corporations with sufficient economic resources can achieve sovereign authority that makes them independent of governmental regulation, while enabling them to manipulate governmental policy to serve corporate rather than public interests. Contemporary multinational corporations wield political influence that exceeds that of most national governments through campaign contributions, lobbying expenditures, and regulatory capture that systematically bias governmental policy toward corporate interests, regardless of electoral outcomes or popular preferences. Amazon's ability to extract billions in tax subsidies while paying minimal corporate taxes demonstrates how contemporary corporations can manipulate governmental policy to serve shareholder interests while avoiding obligations to support public services or infrastructure development. Facebook's ability to operate with minimal regulatory oversight, despite systematic violations of privacy rights, democratic interference, and facilitation of genocidal violence, demonstrates how contemporary corporations can achieve practical immunity from meaningful governmental accountability. The pharmaceutical industry's ability to maintain patent monopolies that generate extraordinary profits while preventing access to essential medications demonstrates how contemporary corporations can use legal frameworks to create artificial scarcity that serves shareholder interests while causing systematic human suffering. The second lesson concerns the use of systematic violence to achieve corporate objectives. The VOC demonstrated that private corporations could employ military force more efficiently than traditional governments if corporate executives were willing to use unlimited brutality against civilian populations who interfered with profit maximization. Contemporary multinational corporations continue to employ systematic violence against resistant populations while maintaining legal protection through sophisticated corporate structures that provide plausible deniability for corporate crimes. Mining corporations routinely employ private military contractors to eliminate indigenous resistance to resource extraction projects. Agricultural corporations collaborate with paramilitary forces to suppress labor organizing among plantation workers. Technology corporations provide surveillance equipment and data analysis that enable governmental repression against political dissidents. These corporate crimes receive minimal media attention and virtually no legal accountability, because contemporary legal systems maintain the limited liability principles originally developed to protect VOC shareholders from responsibility for colonial violence. The third lesson concerns corporate manipulation of financial markets to extract wealth from productive economic activity while contributing nothing to actual economic development. The VOC pioneered techniques for using market manipulation, monopoly control, and systematic corruption to generate extraordinary profits without providing corresponding benefits to local populations or global economic development. Contemporary financial institutions employ high-frequency trading, derivative speculation, and systematic market manipulation to extract wealth from productive economic activity while creating financial instability that damages national economies and impoverishes working populations. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated how contemporary corporations can use sophisticated financial instruments to generate enormous profits for corporate executives and shareholders while imposing catastrophic losses on ordinary citizens who had no involvement in corporate decision-making but suffered the consequences of corporate crimes. Wall Street banks generated billions in profits from mortgage-backed securities they knew would collapse, while ordinary homeowners lost their life savings and faced foreclosure because of financial fraud they couldn't understand or prevent. The fourth lesson concerns corporate control over information systems that enable manipulation of public opinion while preventing meaningful democratic oversight of corporate activities. The VOC understood that controlling information was essential for maintaining popular support for systematic exploitation while preventing effective political opposition to corporate power. Contemporary technology corporations control information distribution through social media platforms, search engines, and data collection systems that enable systematic manipulation of public opinion while providing unprecedented surveillance capabilities that threaten democratic institutions. Google's ability to manipulate search results to favor corporate interests while suppressing information about corporate crimes. Facebook's ability to distribute political disinformation that influences electoral outcomes while collecting personal data that enables unprecedented surveillance of private citizens. Amazon's ability to monitor consumer behavior while using that information to destroy competing businesses. These information control capabilities provide contemporary corporations with power to manipulate democratic processes that exceed anything available to historical authoritarian governments because corporate information control operates through market mechanisms that maintain appearance of consumer choice while eliminating meaningful alternatives. The fifth lesson concerns the psychological mechanisms that enable educated populations to support systematic exploitation while maintaining self-image as moral people. The VOC succeeded because Dutch society could celebrate extraordinary investment returns while remaining psychologically isolated from the systematic violence required to generate those returns. Contemporary societies employ similar psychological mechanisms to support corporate crimes while maintaining belief in democratic values, human rights, and ethical business practices. American consumers can celebrate low prices for consumer goods while ignoring the systematic labor exploitation, environmental destruction, and political corruption required to provide those low prices. European investors can support socially responsible investment portfolios while receiving returns generated from systematic corporate crimes in developing nations. Academic institutions can teach business ethics while providing professional training that enables participation in systematic exploitation. The sixth lesson concerns the international institutional frameworks that enable corporate exploitation while providing appearance of legitimate international cooperation. The VOC operated through treaty systems that recognized corporate sovereign authority while preventing meaningful legal accountability for corporate crimes against local populations. Contemporary international institutions serve similar functions by enforcing corporate-friendly policies against resistant national governments while maintaining appearance of legitimate international law and cooperative economic development. The World Trade Organization systematically prevents national governments from regulating multinational corporations that employ environmental destruction, labor exploitation, or systematic corruption. The International Monetary Fund imposes economic policies that facilitate corporate resource extraction, while preventing national governments from protecting local populations from corporate crimes. These international institutions provide legal frameworks that enable systematic corporate exploitation while preventing meaningful democratic accountability for corporate crimes. because the institutions serve corporate interests rather than population welfare regardless of electoral outcomes in national democracies. The most important lesson concerns the necessity for systematic institutional changes that would subordinate corporate power to democratic authority rather than continuing to rely on voluntary corporate responsibility or market mechanisms to prevent corporate crimes. The VOC's corporate crimes weren't caused by inadequate regulation or insufficient market competition. They were caused by institutional frameworks that prioritized private profit maximization over public welfare while providing legal protection for systematic corporate violence against vulnerable populations. Contemporary corporate crimes operate through similar institutional frameworks that enable systematic exploitation while providing legal immunity and political protection for corporate executives and shareholders who profit from systematic human suffering. Meaningful solutions require fundamental changes to corporate legal structures, financial regulations, and international institutions that would eliminate limited liability protection for systematic corporate crimes, prevent corporate political influence that undermines democratic governance, and subordinate corporate profit maximization to democratic oversight and human welfare considerations. These institutional changes face enormous political obstacles because contemporary corporate power exceeds that of most national governments while operating through international systems that prevent meaningful democratic oversight or legal accountability. But the VOC's eventual collapse demonstrates that even the most powerful corporate institutions cannot sustain indefinite exploitation against populations who understand that corporate success requires their permanent subordination. Understanding VOC precedents provides essential perspective for recognizing how contemporary corporate power threatens democratic institutions and human welfare, while offering guidance for developing institutional changes that could subordinate corporate power to democratic authority and human survival. The lessons aren't historical curiosities, they're survival instructions for societies that want to maintain democratic governance and human welfare in an era of unprecedented corporate power. When you examine the complete arc of the VOC's corporate empire, you're looking at the blueprint for modern capitalism, a system designed to generate extraordinary wealth for private investors through systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations while maintaining legal protection against accountability for human consequences. The scale of what the VOC accomplished remains breathtaking. A single private corporation controlled territory larger than Europe, governed over 4 million people, and generated profits equivalent to $7.9 trillion in modern currency. They demonstrated that private organizations could achieve imperial power more efficiently than traditional governments if they were willing to use unlimited violence in pursuit of unlimited profits. But the most disturbing aspect of VOC history isn't the systematic brutality. It's how successfully they disguised that brutality as legitimate business activity while creating institutional frameworks that continue to protect corporate crimes today. Every major aspect of contemporary capitalism traces directly to innovations the VOC developed for maximizing colonial profit extraction. Limited liability that protects shareholders from responsibility for corporate crimes. Transfer pricing that enables tax avoidance through internal corporate transactions. Regulatory arbitrage that allows corporations to exploit differences between national legal systems. Market manipulation that creates artificial scarcity to maximize prices. The psychological mechanisms that enabled VOC shareholders to celebrate extraordinary dividend payments while ignoring systematic genocide continue to enable contemporary investors to profit from corporate crimes while maintaining belief in ethical business practices and democratic values. Modern consumers can purchase products manufactured using enslaved labor, agricultural goods produced through environmental destruction, and natural resources extracted through military collaboration, all while maintaining psychological comfort that market participation represents legitimate commercial activity rather than complicity in ongoing corporate crimes. The educational systems that teach business history consistently celebrate VOC innovation, organizational efficiency, and financial success while minimizing or completely ignoring the systematic violence against indigenous populations that generated corporate wealth. Business schools throughout Europe and North America teach VOC case studies as examples of successful strategic planning without meaningful discussion of genocide, slavery, or environmental destruction. This educational approach creates psychological conditions for accepting contemporary corporate crimes as inevitable business realities, while providing professional training that enables participation in systematic exploitation disguised as legitimate career development. The legal frameworks that enabled VOC territorial control while preventing accountability for corporate crimes established precedents that